I always thought I understood money. I mean, it was my job. As a financial analyst for a mid-sized company, my job was simple. Make sure people were paid on time, that taxes were correct, that benefits were processed. I looked at numbers all day, and numbers were objective, precise. If someone received a fixed salary, how could they be struggling? I never stopped to think about it much until the day Sarah, our receptionist, disappeared. She was the kind of person you saw
Realized
every
you
day
never really
and
paid
suddenly,
attention.
Always smiling, he greeted everyone when they arrived and left with that calm voice of someone who seemed to have everything under control. But one day, she didn't show up. At first, no one thought it was strange. Maybe he was sick. Maybe he took a few days off. But a week passed, then two. Until, by chance, I overheard a rumor in HR. Sarah had been fired. Sarah's eviction affected me in a way I didn't expect. It was hard to swallow. How could someone who had worked at the company for years end up without a place to live? I went to look at her records just to satisfy my curiosity. Everything seemed right. Fixed salary, payments made on time, no irregularities. But then reality set in. The amount she was earning was ridiculously low. It wasn't enough to pay rent and still live with a minimum of dignity. That's when I started to notice little things around me that had previously gone unnoticed. Colleagues who refused invitations to go out for lunch, always with some excuse. The people in the operations department whispering about settling some debts before the end of the month, and the tired looks of those who seemed to carry an invisible weight. Something didn't make sense, and for the first time I wanted to understand what was really going on. I started paying more attention to the behaviors around me, and with each passing day, it became clearer that something was wrong. I noticed how tense some of my colleagues were around payday, checking their phones compulsively as if they were waiting for some urgent confirmation. I noticed that some people left the office exactly on time, without a minute's extra, as if every second away was crucial. But what really hit me was when I saw one of the guys from ITIM-Mark, always good-natured and joking, brushing his teeth in the office bathroom at 9 o'clock at night. He tried to hide it when he saw me, made some random comment about a project that was late, but at that moment, something felt wrong. No one stayed that late without a good reason, and no one carried that much of a backpack just for an extra shift. Not in that environment. But I still didn't want to accept the truth that was beginning to form in my head. It wasn't until I found a forgotten bank statement in the printer that it really hit me. The paper was folded, but I saw the employee's name in the corner, Lisa from customer service. The account balance was negative, and a ridiculous amount had been withdrawn from a payroll loan. My first reaction was discomfort. It wasn't my business. But the more I thought about it, the more I felt I needed to understand. I started pulling up internal data, nothing confidential, just salary statistics that were already common knowledge, and what I saw was shocking. Almost a third of the company's employees earned so little that after paying rent, they had almost nothing left. Many relied on credit cards or loans to cover the basics. That's when I realized the idea that a steady paycheck meant stability was a lie. I had lived my entire life believing that if someone was struggling financially, it was because they were mismanaging their money. But what if there was never enough money to manage? After that day, I couldn't look at the office the same way anymore. Every hallway, every messy desk, every tired face told me something I hadn't seen before. I began to notice the tiredness disguised in jokes about living on coffee, the cheap snacks that replaced real lunches, the worn-out clothes that some people wore without anyone commenting. I started going out a little later, not because I was overworked, but because I wanted to watch. And that's how I discovered what made my stomach churn. Some people just didn't go home. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. Then I realized it wasn't. There were employees leaving the building and standing in the parking lot for hours. Some got into their cars and only left the next morning. I saw this happen several times before I could admit to myself what it meant. One night, I waited until later than usual, parked far enough away to avoid being noticed. That's when I saw Lisa, yes, the same one from the forgotten bank statement, getting into her car and turning off the lights. No movement after that, no sign of her going home. I was there long enough to realize she had nowhere to go. She was sleeping in her car. I drove home that night with a heavy heart. All of this was happening around me. And I had never noticed. I had never asked. I had never imagined that something like this could be real. And the worst part was knowing that Lisa wasn't the only one. How many other people were living like this? How many co-workers who smiled and joked in the cafe were counting pennies to make ends meet? After that night, something inside me changed. I wanted to believe that this was an isolated case, but the more I observed, the more I saw signs that had previously gone unnoticed. Adam, logistics, always arrived earlier than everyone else. But not because he was dedicated, it was because he spent the night driving for a ride-sharing app to make ends meet. Maria, a member of the administrative team, used the company microwave to heat up instant noodles for breakfast and dinner because she couldn't afford better meals. And then the worst happened. One Friday night, leaving work, I saw one of the interns, Jake, taking a shower in the bathroom sink. He didn't see me, but I stood there, frozen, listening to the sound of the tap, watching him rub his arms like someone who no longer cared about hiding his situation. My stomach turned. That was not a passing crisis. It was a constant reality, one I had never seen before. At first, I didn't know what to do with this information. Talking about it felt like an invasion, like I was snooping into other people's lives without permission. But ignoring it didn't feel right either. I spent the weekend reading everything I could about the so-called invisible working class, people who have steady jobs and still can't pay rent without drowning in debt. I read about people living in their cars, about those who skipped meals to save money, about employees who had to choose between paying for health insurance or putting food on the table. And suddenly, it all made sense. The numbers I analyzed every day at work didn't tell that part of the story. The growth charts, the budget spreadsheets, the financial reports, they were all a cold, distorted version of reality. And now that I saw the whole picture, I couldn't look away anymore. On Monday, I returned to work with a strange feeling, as if I were seeing everything for the first time. The office looked the same, desks tidy, keyboards clicking, people walking back and forth with cups of cheap coffee. But now I saw details I had ignored before. I noticed how Jake kept a backpack close at hand, as if he were carrying his entire life inside. I saw Lisa avoiding my handful of free cookies from the pantry, as if it were her only meal of the day. And then something even worse happened. Sarah came back, but not to take back her job. She came to collect her last check, which included the days she had worked before she disappeared. The company had already hired a new receptionist, and when I saw Sarah up close, my heart sank. She looked different. Her hair greasy, her clothes wrinkled, her eyes sunken. She tried to smile when she saw me, but it was a weak, broken smile. I wanted to talk to her, ask where she was staying, if she needed help. But what could I say? "I'm sorry, I didn't know you were in this situation." Would that change anything? Instead, I stood there, watching as she signed some papers, picked up her check, and left. No one asked how she was. No one seemed to care. And it was at that moment that I realized that this was the scariest part of all, the indifference. People were so used to seeing colleagues disappear overnight that it no longer made a difference. I wondered how many times this had happened without me noticing. How many Sarahs had walked through the office, smiling for as long as they could, only to disappear. That night I went home trying to ignore the suffocating feeling that I was surrounded by ghosts. Not in the literal sense, but ghosts of lives that were crumbling right before my eyes. I spent hours staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything I had discovered. What made me most uneasy was that, until recently, I was like everyone else there. I believed that if someone was experiencing financial difficulties, it was because they had made bad choices. I had never stopped to consider that maybe there was no choice at all, that maybe the game was rigged from the start, and that some people were trapped in a battle they could never win. What if Lisa, Jake, Sarah, and so many others were doing everything right, but the system just wouldn't let them out of the hole? This idea tormented me. The next day, I decided to test something out. I grabbed a notebook and calculated realistically how much the average office worker made and how much they spent on the essentials: rent, transportation, food, bills. No luxuries, no excesses, just the bare essentials, and the results were devastating. After paying all the essentials, there was almost nothing left. Any unexpected event, a doctor's appointment, a car repair, a higher electric bill, could push someone straight into this red. It made me sick to my stomach. I saw the numbers every day, but I'd never analyzed them like this. Suddenly, everything made sense. The late nights in the parking lot, the showers in the office bathroom, the skipped meals. They weren't irresponsible. They weren't lazy. They were stuck. And worse, no one seemed to care. I tried to go on with my routine as if nothing had changed, but it was impossible. Every hallway conversation, every email about budget cuts, every joke about how to death work seemed to carry a weight I hadn't understood before. The worst part was knowing that for most people there, that was normal. No one thought it was strange that a colleague was exhausted all the time. No one wondered why some people never attended the get-togethers or why they brought the same frozen lunch every single day. It was as if there was a collective acceptance that life was just like that some people would simply never get out of trouble. But I couldn't accept it, and the more I tried to ignore it, the more that thought consumed me. That's when I decided I needed to talk to someone about this. I couldn't keep it to myself. At first, I tried to casually broach the subject with a colleague in HR. but he just shrugged and said something about people needing to learn to live within their means. Then I mentioned it to a close friend in the office, and he just laughed and said, if it were easy, everyone would be rich. It frustrated me. No one seemed to admit the obvious, that the system was a trap, that having a steady job didn't mean security, that any of us could be on the verge of losing everything. But no one wanted to listen. It was more comfortable to pretend the problem didn't exist. After these frustrating conversations, I realized that if I wanted to better understand what was going on, I would have to do it myself. So I started paying even more attention. I started eating lunch in the cafeteria instead of going out to eat, just to observe who brought in cheap lunch boxes and who skipped the meal altogether. I noticed strange patterns, like employees who always left during lunch but never returned with food. One day I accidentally, or maybe on purpose, followed one of these colleagues and saw him sneaking into a church downtown. After doing some research, I discovered that they were giving out free meals to people in need. I wanted to believe that this was just a coincidence, but how many more coincidences like that would have to happen before I had to admit it was true? The situation had affected me so much that I began to wonder if I was even safe. I was earning a little more than many of my peers, but what if something happened? What if I lost my job? How long could I hold on before I was in the same situation as them? I did the math, and the result gave me chills. If I lost my salary tomorrow, in a few months I would be counting pennies, juggling to pay the bills, maybe even facing eviction. Like Sarah, and suddenly it didn't feel like a question about other people anymore. It was about any one of us. It was about how fragile our false sense of stability really was. With this newfound awareness, I began to notice little details that I had previously overlooked, like how some employees were always asking for an advance on their salaries, but they never seemed to get out of trouble, or how the resignations that I had previously dismissed as just market movements were often coming from people who were on the brink of financial collapse and simply didn't have the energy to keep going. One day I came across an internal report that showed an increase in the number of people asking for time off due to stress and anxiety. It was no coincidence. People weren't just tired of their jobs. They were being crushed by a system that demanded everything from them and gave almost nothing in return. I started reading about companies offering better conditions for their employees, about programs that guaranteed fair wages and real benefits. But the more I read, the more I realized that our office didn't do any of these things because it didn't have to. The company knew that in the end, no one would complain. People were afraid of losing their jobs, so they would accept whatever the conditions. And I hated myself for only realizing this now. For years, I had analyzed payrolls, adjusted budgets, made recommendations for cost cuts, without ever asking myself who exactly was paying the price. Now I knew, and I could no longer pretend I didn't know. So I made a decision. If no one wanted to talk about it, I would. I started drafting an informal report, something that would show the reality behind the numbers, that would explain how so many employees were on the brink of financial collapse despite having steady jobs. I made sure to include real stories, no names, but with enough detail that anyone paying attention would recognize the situations. I worked on it, gathering information, cross-referencing data, trying to find a way to show that this wasn't just an individual problem, but a structural problem. I knew that throwing this reality in the boss's faces wouldn't go over well, but it didn't matter anymore. When I was done, I saved the document and stared at my computer screen for a long time. I knew that once I sent it, there would be no going back. Maybe they would fire me. Maybe they would just ignore me. But deep down, I hoped that at least it would make a difference. I took a deep breath, attached the file to an email addressed to the directors, and hit send. For a moment, I felt a sense of relief. But that relief was short-lived, because the next day when I got to the office, I noticed something was different. People were looking at me strangely. Some were looking away, some were whispering. And then I was called into a meeting. The meeting room was colder than usual, or maybe it was just me breaking out in a cold sweat. On the other side of the table were two directors and my direct boss, all with grim expressions. One of the directors held a printed copy of my report, his fingers gripping the pages tightly. I knew what was coming next before they even opened their mouths. My boss began by speaking in a rehearsed tone, saying that my raising was concerning, but that I should have approached it in a more appropriate manner. The other director was more direct. He asked if I understood the negative impact I could have on team morale by spreading unnecessary and sensationalist information. I swallowed hard. It wasn't like I didn't expect that reaction, but hearing those words out loud made my stomach turn. They tried to downplay everything. They said the company offered a competitive benefits package that anyone struggling could go to HR to discuss solutions. It was hard to contain my anger. They had no idea that no one went to HR because they knew it would just brand them as problematic. I tried to argue, but it was like talking to a brick wall. To them, this was just another setback to be solved with bureaucracy. In the end, I was let go with a warning to not get involved in matters that were outside my responsibilities. When I left the room, my heart was pounding in my chest. My boss didn't even glance my way as he walked by. I knew it. My position within that company would never be the same again. Over the next few days, the tension around me was palpable. Some colleagues quietly messaged me, saying they thought what I had done was brave, but none of them wanted to talk about it in person. Others simply walked away. In the end, the company didn't fire me, but it was clear that they were waiting for me to quit on my own. My workload increased dramatically, and small changes began to happen. My suggestions were ignored. Invitations to meetings I normally attended stopped coming. They wanted to wear me down until I made the decision for myself. And in the end, they succeeded. 2 months later, I quit. Not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't continue there any longer. The weight of knowing the truth and seeing everything swept under the rug was unbearable. On my last day, I left the office without looking back. But one thing never left me. That feeling that even outside of there, I still carried the story of all those people who were trying to survive day after day. After I left the company, I tried to move on. I got another job in a place that at first glance seemed less toxic, but the truth is that the situation was the same. The same tired faces, the same forced smiles, the same conversations about overdue bills and the daily struggle to make the salary last until the end of the month. That's when I realized that this wasn't an isolated problem at the company I worked for before. It was a much bigger problem, something rooted in the way the corporate world viewed its employees as numbers on a spreadsheet, as expenses to be cut whenever necessary. For a while, I was obsessed with this idea. I read studies, I participated in forums, I talked to people who had been through the same thing. The stories were always similar. People working themselves to death and still falling into debt. Entire families living in fear of a single unforeseen event that could throw them into poverty. I began to realize how everything was designed to keep people trapped in this machine. The cost of living was rising, wages were stagnant, and any attempt to discuss it was seen as ingratitude or weakness. And worst of all, most people accepted it because they had no choice. To this day, I don't know if what I did at that company was of any use. Maybe it was just a passing annoyance to the directors, something they forgot about once I stopped being a problem. But one thing I'm sure of, after that day, I never looked at a pay stub the same way again. I never again ignored when someone hesitated before accepting invitation to lunch. I never again judged those who took out loans or those who preferred to pretend that everything was fine. Because now I knew, now I saw, and once you see it, there's no going back. So if you are reading this and can relate to this, know that you are not alone. The system was designed to make you think that the problem is yours, that it is a matter of effort, of knowing how to organize yourself better. But it is not. It is bigger than us. And if there is one thing I have, it is that a salary at the end of the month does not mean security. Because numbers do not lie, but they also do not tell the whole truth. After I left the company, I tried to move on. I got another job in a place that at first glance seemed less toxic, but the truth is that the situation was the same. The same tired faces, the same forced smiles, the same conversations about overdue bills, and the daily struggle to make the salary last until the end of the month. That's when I realized that this wasn't an isolated problem at the company I worked for before. It was a much bigger problem, something rooted in the way the corporate world viewed its employees, as numbers on a spreadsheet, as expenses to be cut whenever necessary. For a while, I was obsessed with this idea. I read studies, I participated in forums, I talked to people who had been through the same thing. The stories were always similar. People working themselves to death and still falling into debt, entire families living in fear of a single unforeseen event that could throw them into poverty. I began to realize how everything was designed to keep people trapped in this machine. The cost of living was rising, wages were stagnant, and any attempt to discuss it was seen as ingratitude or weakness. And worst of all, most people accepted it because they had no choice. To this day, I don't know if what I did at that company was of any use. Maybe it was just a passing annoyance, something they forgot about once I stopped being a problem. But one thing I'm sure of, after that day, I never looked at a pay stub the same way again. I never again ignored when someone hesitated before accepting an invitation to lunch. I never again judged those who took out loans or those who preferred to pretend that everything was fine. Because now I knew, now I saw, And once you see it, there's no going back. So if you are reading this and can relate to this, know not alone that you are. The system was designed to make you think that the problem is yours, that it is a matter of effort, of knowing how to organize yourself better. But it is not. It is bigger than us. And if there is one thing I have learned from all of this, it is that a salary at the end of the month does not mean security. Because numbers do not lie, but they also do not tell the whole truth. But this story doesn't end there. A few weeks after leaving the company, I received an unexpected message. It was from a former colleague I barely knew, someone I exchanged few words with during the time I was there. He said he heard about my report and wanted to thank me. Not because things had changed, but because, for the first time, someone within the company had said out loud what everyone felt. He was also leaving, not because I had found something better, but because I couldn't stand living in that suffocating cycle any longer. After that, I started getting more messages. Some former colleagues said the company had tightened its policy of internal loans, trying to give the impression that they were looking after their employees. Others said nothing had changed yet, but that at least the conversation about the issue had not died down completely. I slowly realized that even if I hadn't brought down the system, I had at least caused a crack in it. And sometimes a crack is all it takes for something to start falling apart. That's why months later I decided to do something I'd never imagined before. I started writing. I turned my experiences and the stories I heard into anonymous articles, sharing everything on forums, groups, and social networks. At first it was just a rant, but I soon realized that there were many other people going through the same thing. What once seemed like an isolated problem has turned out to be a silent epidemic. One night I got an email from someone who had worked at the same company I had worked at for years. He said management was more careful, that small adjustments were being made to avoid another internal crisis. They would never admit that my report had an impact, but I knew the truth. I might never see radical change, but knowing that my voice had not been lost in the void was enough for me. And now, every time I see someone sitting in a coffee shop, counting their coins before ordering a coffee, or a supermarket employee calculating how much they can take home at the end of the day, I'm reminded of all of this. I'm reminded of how much we've learned to normalize the unacceptable. But at least now I know I'm not the only one who sees it. And if you've read this far, maybe you've started to see it too.